Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. We're going to take a look at the EPA's climate change indicators. According to Reuters, the United States is under ongoing threat from climate change. They say that the Trump administration took away the EPA webpage which detailed these threats. But the Biden administration has restored the EPA webpage, and these are the threats which Reuters details. They say heat waves across the country are more frequent, more intense, and last longer. Wildfires are burning more land. The eastern Gulf coasts are flooding more often, while ice sheets are disappearing and sea levels are rising. Let's take a look at these claims and at the EPA website. The website says climate change is happening now, and they have a graph of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere showing a big spike in recent years. The intent here is to convince the reader that carbon dioxide controls the climate. I'll be talking more about that at the end of this video, but for now let's just look at some of their other claims. They show graphs claiming to show that heat waves are getting worse since the 1960s in the United States. But why did they pick the 1960s for the start date? We have temperature data going back much further than that. This is the old heat wave graph from the EPA, and it shows that heat waves are much worse prior to 1960. So what the EPA has done is they've hidden all of the data which wrecks their story about increasing heat waves. The reality is that heat waves were much worse in the United States prior to 1960 than they've been over the past 60 years. And these graphs from the 2018 National Climate Assessment showed the same thing. Heat wave frequency, intensity, and duration were all much worse in the United States prior to 1960. So by hiding the data prior to 1960, they're misleading the public. Summers are getting shorter and cooler in the United States, as I'm about to show you. May temperatures in the United States have been declining for over 100 years. The hottest May by far occurred during 1934. There were 3 massive heat waves during May 1934, including one at the end of the month which brought temperatures of 110 degrees to South Dakota. Iowa reached 109 degrees during that same heat wave of May 1934. That's pretty incredible. Iowa very rarely gets over 100 degrees anymore, even during July, much less 109 degrees during May. The frequency of hot days during May has plummeted in the United States over the past century, with 1934 being the hottest and 1911 coming in a close second. Another trend is that the first day of the year above 80 degrees Fahrenheit has gotten considerably later over the past century. In other words, spring is getting longer and summer is getting shorter in the United States. Now let's look at summer temperatures in the United States. They've also gotten much cooler over the past century. And the frequency of hot summer days has plummeted in the United States since the 1930s. Now let's look at September temperatures, which have also declined over the past century. September afternoon temperatures have been declining, and the average last day above 90 degrees Fahrenheit is coming earlier in the United States than it did a century ago. Summer is getting shorter in the United States. It's starting later and it's ending earlier. Prior to 60 years ago, hot September days were much more common in the United States than they've been since. 100-degree September days were relatively common in the United States prior to the year 1960, which is why the EPA hides all the data prior to 1960 now. Let's take a look for a minute at the remarkable heat wave of May 1911. 1911 had a lot of deadly heat waves, but the heat wave on this date 110 years ago was really remarkable. On May 22, 1911, almost all of the northeastern United States was over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and Virginia and Maine recorded temperatures over 100 degrees. This would be pretty remarkable weather for July, much less in May. The Sydney Morning Herald reported on May 22, 1911, the terrific heat wave that's sweeping over the United States has been responsible for hundreds of deaths. Later that summer was the hottest July 4th on record in the United States, and thousands of people died in the heat in New England, and in Europe tens of thousands of people died from the heat. Now let's look at how the U.S. government is hiding the decline in heat in the United States over the past century. This is the actual measured thermometer data from NOAA's United States Historical Climatology Network. It shows that summer afternoon temperatures in the United States have plummeted over the last 90 years. But this doesn't suit the global warming agenda, so NOAA alters the data to make it look like it's a warming trend. This is the data which NOAA reports to the public, and this is what the actual thermometer data shows. They're turning a strong cooling trend into a warming trend. Now let's switch gears and look at the EPA's Climate Change Indicators Wildfires webpage. They start this graph in 1983 and show data from the United States Forest Service and from the National Interagency Fire Center. But why did they start the graph in 1983? The Forest Service has data going back to at least 1916. The EPA hid all of the Forest Service data prior to 1983. The EPA wants people to believe that forest fire burn acreage is increasing in the United States, so they hid all of this inconvenient data, which shows that that story simply isn't true. A lot more acreage used to burn in the United States than does now. They try to claim that the data from the past isn't accurate or they don't know what the source is, but that simply isn't true. Here's an article from the New York Times dated October 9, 1938. Forest fires 1 every 3 minutes in 1937 burned 21,980,500 acres. The Forest Service of the Department of Agriculture reported this data. Then they go on and say the number of fires in 1937 was 18% less than in the previous year, while the burned acreage was only slightly more than half the acreage burned in 1936. And if we look at the graph, we can see that data. This is 1937, and this is 1936. The Biden administration is hiding all of this data because it wrecks their story. They want people to believe that forest fires are increasing because of an increase in carbon dioxide, but the actual data shows the opposite. The red line is forest fire burn acreage, which has plummeted, and the green line is atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. You can see they're trending opposite of each other. The fear-mongering about carbon dioxide is not supported by data, which is why the Biden administration is hiding all of the critical data prior to 1983. There's no correlation between burn acreage and CO2, but if we hide the data prior to 1983, it looks like there is a correlation. This graph starts in 1983 and it shows burn acreage in blue and carbon dioxide in green. It looks like there's a correlation, but there isn't. The Biden administration hid all of the critical data in order to deceive the public and make people believe that carbon dioxide is a threat. Now let's look at sea ice at the poles. Arctic sea ice extent is just below the 1981 to 2010 median. In fact, May 20th Arctic sea ice extent is almost exactly average for Alexandria Cortez's lifetime. She was born in 1989 and extent is a little higher now than it was that year. And at the other pole, Antarctic sea ice extent is a little bit above average. So between the two poles, the extent of sea ice on Earth is just about average since 1981. This is obviously not a crisis and not what Nobel Prize winner Al Gore predicted in 2007. He predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by the year 2014.
Another new study to be presented by U.S. Navy researchers later this week warns it could happen in as little as 7 years. 7 years from now. In the last few months, it has been harder and harder to misinterpret the signs that our world is spinning out of kilter.
Now let's look at the last sentence from the Reuters report. The eastern Gulf coasts are flooding more often, while ice sheets are disappearing and sea levels are rising. That sounds pretty alarming. Let's see if it's actually true. Sea level is indeed rising. In fact, it's risen 120 meters or 400 feet in the last 20,000 years. But almost all of that rise occurred prior to 7,000 years ago. 20,000 years ago, sea level was so low that people were able to walk across the Bering Strait from Russia into Alaska. At that time, Chicago was buried under a mile of ice, but then the ice melted and sea level rose until about 7,000 years ago. Let's take a look now at what tide gauges actually show around the United States. Sea level at Juneau, Alaska has been declining sharply over the last 80 years at the same steady rate of about 13 millimeters per year. But sea level isn't actually declining. What's happening is that the land at Juneau, Alaska is rising up, and it makes it look like sea level is falling. But the key point here is that this is a straight line. There's no curvature to it. If sea level rise rates were accelerating, we would see an upwards curvature. That curvature doesn't exist at Juneau. It doesn't exist at Seattle. It's a straight line. It doesn't exist at Astoria. Straight line. It doesn't exist at Crescent City, California. It's a straight line. The sea level graph at La Jolla, California is also a straight line. There's no upwards curvature. There's no indication that sea level rise rates are accelerating. At Galveston, Texas, it's also a straight line. There's no upwards curvature. Sea level appears to be rising at Galveston, but what's actually happening is that the land there is sinking. Same story at Fernandina Beach, Florida, and at Baltimore, Maryland, and at Atlantic City, New Jersey, and at the Battery in New York, at Manhattan, and at Boston, Massachusetts. There's no indication that sea level rise rates have accelerated over the past century. So people claiming that sea level rise rates are increasing because of carbon dioxide are simply not telling the truth. If sea level rise rates were accelerating, every single one of the graphs I just showed you would have an upwards curvature, but none of them do. Once again, the Biden administration is committing fraud in order to deceive the public. The goal is to demonize fossil fuels by demonizing carbon dioxide. We see a lot of articles like this. The last time CO2 levels were as high as today, ocean waters drowned the lands where metropolises like Houston, Miami, and New York City now exist. They say that temperatures were much warmer back then, 5 degrees warmer in fact. A logical person might think of this in different terms. A person who actually uses their brain might say, well, we have the same amount of carbon dioxide now, but temperatures are 5 degrees cooler, so obviously carbon dioxide does not control the climate. If carbon dioxide did control the climate, then temperatures now should be comparable to what they were last time CO2 levels were this high. But this isn't about rational thinking. It's about generating hysteria. Democrats in Congress asked Google to act against dangerous climate misinformation on YouTube. They want people like me censored, but the dangerous climate misinformation is coming from them. The U.S. became energy independent under President Trump, but Joe Biden has shut down U.S. energy production. He stopped all new oil leases on federal lands, and he shut down the Keystone Pipeline. And this is exactly what he said he was going to do when he was speaking to left-wing groups.
But kiddo, I want you to just take a look, okay? You don't have to agree, but I want you to look in my eyes. I guarantee you, we're going to end fossil fuel, and I am not going to cooperate. Okay?
As a direct result of Biden's actions, gasoline prices in the United States are now over $3 a gallon. The last time that happened was 7 years ago when Joe Biden was also in the White House. The U.S. is once again dependent on Middle East oil, and not surprisingly, war has returned to the Middle East after a 4-year absence. And Democrats are not only shutting down coal, oil, and natural gas, but they're also shutting down nuclear power. Governor Cuomo of New York killed tens of thousands of grandmas and grandpas last year by sending thousands of sick people into nursing homes, and now it looks like he also wants to cull the general population of the state. People can't survive without an adequate supply of energy, as Texas found out the hard way this year. Cuomo is recklessly shutting down every reliable energy source in the state. These Democrats are committing a very ugly big lie with this climate scam, and history shows us that every time government commits a big lie like this, they have very bad intentions in mind. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this climate death cult for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.